They say a single note can change a life, whispered Emily Hartwell as she clutched the edge of the polished piano, her knuckles white beneath the dim candlelight of Whitmore Hall. The storm outside lashed against the tall windows, sending shards of snow tumbling across the marble floor and whistling through the gaps of the ancient door frames. She drew a trembling breath, trying to steady the rapid thrum of her heart as she adjusted the sheet music on the stand. The grand hall was silent, vast, and cold, lined with towering portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every movement. Somewhere in the shadows, Duke Alexander Whitmore watched, his presence a quiet weight, steel-gray eyes narrowing as they followed her delicate fingers hovering above the ivory keys. Emily's auburn hair clung damply to her neck from the sleet she had brushed off in the vestibule, and she wrapped her hands tighter around herself, feeling both anticipation and fear coil in her chest. She had been summoned unexpectedly to perform a waltz in front of the Duke, a man whose reputation for icy perfection preceded him, a man who had not shown the slightest sign of amusement in years, a man rumored to weigh every gesture of every visitor against some invisible scale of judgment. Her first notes trembled in the silence, the sound spilling into the cavernous hall, echoing against the stone walls and catching the faint flicker of candlelight. The melody, delicate and precise, was more than music. It was her lifeline, her voice, the language of a soul too timid to speak in ordinary words. Alexander remained motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, the sharp cut of his profile outlined against the roaring fire in the hearth, though the flames did little to soften the shadowed austerity of his presence. As the waltz unfolded, Emily felt the room shrink around her, the distance between them charged with something unspoken. Each measure she played seemed to reach for him, threading invisible tendrils through the tension that lay thick in the air. She dared to glance up, meeting his eyes for the briefest moment, and the world fell away. The storm outside, the cold stone floors, the echoing portraits, all dimmed beneath the current of recognition passing silently between them. There was no gesture, no word, yet something shifted, imperceptible yet undeniable, like the subtle tilt of a scale that finally tips after years of balance. Her fingers danced with renewed purpose, the notes flowing more confidently, and Alexander's stern facade faltered for the smallest fraction of a heartbeat, a micro-expression of something softer, something that had been buried beneath layers of protocol and solitude. The air itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the music, each note a heartbeat, each pause a breath held. The waltz reached its first climax, the melody lifting and arching gracefully, and Emily sensed the Duke leaning just slightly forward, a shadow of curiosity flickering in his gaze, a hint that her music had pierced the walls he had built around himself. The final notes trailed into silence, a delicate echo lingering like the last wisp of smoke from a candle guttering in the draft. Emily's chest heaved, her hands resting on the keys, trembling yet exhilarated, and she finally allowed herself to meet his eyes fully, catching the faintest glimmer of acknowledgement, an unspoken promise that this moment, this single performance, had already begun to change everything between them. The soft echo of the final note lingered in the grand hall, weaving through the shadows and flickering candlelight, as Emily Hartwell slowly lifted her hands from the keys, feeling the warmth of the fire brush against her chilled skin. The room seemed suspended in time, the storm outside momentarily silenced by the heavy stone walls, the distant howl of wind reduced to a faint whisper. Duke Alexander Whitmore remained still, his tall figure framed against the towering windows, eyes fixed on her with a new intensity, a quiet acknowledgement that weighed upon the air between them. Emily took a careful step back from the piano, her gown rustling softly, the ivory fabric catching the glow of the candles as she tried to steady the rapid thrum of her heart. The echo of the melody still hummed through her veins, each note a tether connecting her to the Duke, bridging the distance that had once felt insurmountable. Alexander took a measured step forward, the sound of his boots muted by the thick Persian rug, and for the first time, Emily saw the subtle shift in his posture, the tension around his shoulders easing, if only slightly, as though her music had reached a part of him long untouched. She held his gaze for a fraction of a heartbeat, a silent question mirrored in her amber eyes, and he answered not with words, but with a tilt of his head, the faintest curve of a smile brushing across his stern features. The candles flickered, sending dancing shadows across the portraits lining the hall, and in that quiet interplay of light and darkness, Emily felt a strange courage stir within her, a delicate confidence that the next step, whatever it might be, would not break her. She moved toward the large double doors leading to the balcony, her fingers trailing lightly along the polished wood railing, the wind from the storm outside teasing wisps of her hair across her face. Yet she felt anchored, as if each footstep was guided by the silent rhythm of the waltz that still lingered in the air. Alexander followed, his presence close but respectful, a careful distance maintained, and Emily could feel the subtle warmth radiating from him despite the cold that hung over the castle. She paused at the threshold, peering out into the swirling snow, and Alexander stopped beside her, his gaze lifting to the storm and then returning to her with an intensity that made the world narrow down to this one fleeting, suspended moment. The snow danced like tiny silver sparks in the torchlight below, and Emily found herself inhaling deeply, the crisp air mingling with the scent of burning logs from the hearth, grounding her, yet filling her with a thrilling sense of possibility. Without speaking, they moved together in quiet accord, two figures connected by the invisible threads of music and understanding, their steps measured, deliberate, echoing the cadence of the waltz that had so unexpectedly shifted the balance of power and perception. Emily's hand brushed lightly against the cool surface of the railing, her pulse steadying, and she realized that the Duke's scrutiny no longer felt threatening but keenly attentive, an invitation rather than a judgment. The storm beyond the balcony, once an imposing and menacing presence, became a companion to the intimacy of this moment, its howling winds and falling snow a backdrop to the subtle awakening of trust and curiosity. Alexander's expression softened, just perceptibly, and Emily, sensing the change, allowed herself a brief exhale of relief, her posture relaxing even as the tension of anticipation lingered. They stood together, framed by the frost-laden landscape outside and the warm glow inside, the air thick with unspoken words, shared glances, and the lingering magic of a melody that had done more than fill a hall. It had begun to transform the space between two hearts, hinting at the promise of what might unfold in the quiet hours yet to come. Emily stepped back from the balcony, letting the chill of the evening air brush against her cheeks as the storm began to soften to a steady, gentle snowfall. The castle below glimmered faintly with the reflection of lanterns, their warm glow contrasting with the silver frost that coated the trees and stone walkways. Duke Alexander Whitmore remained beside her, his posture relaxed yet commanding, the aura of quiet authority enveloping him as he watched her, his eyes tracing the subtle movements of her hands and the way her gaze lingered on the delicate patterns of snowflakes dancing in the air. She felt a peculiar calm, the tension that had gripped her moments ago easing as she noticed the way he regarded her with measured interest rather than mere judgment. The hall behind them remained silent except for the distant crackle of the fire, and Emily could feel the weight of that silence pressing gently, inviting reflection. She dared a tentative step closer, the long hem of her gown sweeping across the marble floor, and Alexander did not move away. Instead, he adjusted his stance, his presence an unspoken support, as if he recognized her courage without requiring her to speak a single word. The wind carried a soft whistling through the cracks of the balcony doors, and Emily drew a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs and steady her racing heart. Her thoughts drifted to the piano, the melody still echoing in her mind, each note a reminder of the connection she had forged, tenuous yet undeniable, across the distance of the grand hall and through the silent judgment of the Duke. Alexander tilted his head slightly, the shadow of a smile appearing at the corners of his lips, faint but perceptible, a signal that he acknowledged more than just her performance, but her composure, her poise, and the unspoken resilience she carried with her. Emily allowed herself to smile softly in return, a subtle gesture, yet laden with meaning, as though in that brief exchange they had communicated more than words could capture. The castle itself seemed to breathe with them, the warm light from the hearth casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, intertwining with the silver threads of moonlight that filtered through the frost-laden windows. Emily felt a surge of determination, a quiet confidence that the storm outside, though fierce, could not mirror the potential she sensed growing between them, a bond formed in music, silence, and shared understanding. She lifted her hand slightly, tracing the outline of the balcony railing, and Alexander followed with his gaze, noticing the subtle grace of her movements, the way her fingers lingered for a moment on the smooth wood, deliberate and careful. Each breath, each heartbeat, seemed to synchronize with the lingering notes of her waltz, and Emily realized that the moment had shifted, a new rhythm forming, one that belonged to both of them, tentative yet promising. Alexander's expression softened further, the hardness of authority tempered by genuine curiosity, and Emily, sensing the change, let a small, almost imperceptible nod pass between them, a silent acknowledgement of the understanding that had begun to take root. The storm beyond the balcony, now a gentle cascade of falling snow, seemed to echo the subtle shift within the hall, and Emily felt the first stirrings of hope, a quiet promise that the music had not only reached his ears, but had touched something deeper, something patient and waiting within him. They lingered together in that shared silence, framed by the interplay of firelight and moonlight, snow and stone, two souls recognizing the stirrings of trust and the potential for something entirely unforeseen, yet entirely real, a delicate awakening that neither had fully named, but both sensed as the night stretched on, holding them suspended in a moment that would ripple through the hours to come. The firelight flickered across the polished floorboards as Emily turned from the balcony, the cool air of the evening following her like a gentle whisper, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and snow from the storm outside. Duke Alexander Whitmore remained near the railing, his hands resting lightly on the smooth wood, eyes following her every movement with a quiet attentiveness that made her pulse quicken, though she did not fully understand why. The hall behind them was hushed, the distant murmur of servants preparing the evening meal fading into the background, leaving the space filled with the soft echo of their shared silence. Emily's gaze swept over the frozen landscape beyond the windows, the snow settling in delicate layers across the gardens and courtyard, each flake catching the muted glow of lanterns as if performing a quiet waltz of its own. She could feel the weight of the Duke's presence without the need for words, a tension that was neither oppressive nor distant, but rather a subtle pull, like the first brush of wind across the skin that warns of a coming change. Alexander shifted slightly, the movement almost imperceptible, yet Emily noticed the softening of his eyes, the faint warmth that had begun to edge into the shadows of his normally stern features. She moved further into the hall, her gown whispering against the marble, each step measured, deliberate, carrying a newfound confidence that seemed to have arisen from the music she had played, the melody still echoing in her mind, a bridge that had begun to connect two worlds previously separated by formality and expectation. As she approached the piano once more, she allowed her fingers to hover above the keys, recalling the precise movements of the waltz and the subtle emotions that had guided each note, and Alexander took a careful step closer, his presence a silent encouragement, not a demand, a reassurance that she was seen and appreciated not only for her skill, but for her grace and composure. The firelight flickered again, casting elongated shadows along the walls lined with portraits, the eyes of ancestors seemingly softening, as if acknowledging the significance of this moment, and Emily felt the first genuine sense of being understood in a place where she had previously felt only scrutiny and expectation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the sound muted by the thick walls of the castle, and inside, the hall seemed to pulse gently with the rhythm of their shared breathing, the subtle cadence of anticipation threading through the air, weaving a connection that neither required words nor overt gestures. Alexander's gaze met hers with a depth that caused her to pause. The storm of his thoughts hinted at behind the steel-gray eyes, a flicker of curiosity and admiration now entwined with the authority he naturally commanded. Emily took a step closer to the piano, her fingers lightly brushing the ivory as if testing the surface for the echoes of the music that had brought them to this delicate understanding, and Alexander, observing without interruption, allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod to affirm the unspoken bond forming between them. The air in the hall seemed to hold its breath alongside them, the flicker of candles reflecting in the Duke's eyes and in Emily's own. And in that quiet, suspended space, a promise lingered, fragile yet unmistakable, that the evening had shifted irrevocably, that the music and the shared silence had created a path forward, one that neither had anticipated but both now silently acknowledged, a beginning forged in melody, trust, and the gentle unfolding of mutual respect and curiosity. The hall seemed to hum with the memory of the music as Emily Hartwell allowed herself to breathe more evenly, the rapid beat of her heart slowing as she walked along the edge of the polished marble floor. Duke Alexander Whitmore remained near the fireplace, the flames casting a flickering glow across his angular features, highlighting the subtle change in his expression that had begun to soften the rigid lines of authority into something quietly attentive. Emily's thoughts drifted back to the waltz she had just played, the delicate arpeggios and sustained chords that had carried not only the melody but the emotions she had hidden for so long, and she felt a warmth bloom within her, a quiet triumph that her music had bridged the distance between them. Alexander's gaze followed her movements, keen and observant, yet patient, allowing her the space to collect herself while maintaining a silent presence that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Outside, the storm had subsided into a gentle cascade of snowflakes, drifting lazily against the windows, their soft descent mirrored by the calm settling over the grand hall. Emily stepped closer to a tall, ornate window, tracing the patterns of frost with her fingertips, the cold glass a stark contrast to the firelight warming her back. Alexander moved slightly, his steps measured, and took a place near her side, the space between them charged with the subtle tension of unspoken acknowledgement. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the moment to stretch, observing the delicate features of her face, the way her eyes lingered on the falling snow, and the faint curve of her lips as she considered the path her music had carved for them both. Emily felt the weight of his presence, not as pressure, but as an unspoken invitation, a quiet curiosity that beckoned her to step forward, to trust in the connection that had begun to form. She allowed herself a small, tentative glance up at him, and Alexander met her gaze, a flicker of something warmer passing across the steel-gray depths of his eyes, the first hint of approval and recognition that transcended the formalities of his station. The candles along the walls flickered gently, casting shadows that danced in harmony with the snow outside, creating a tapestry of light and dark that seemed to frame their growing understanding. Emily drew a slow breath, the chill in the air mingling with the warmth from the hearth, grounding her yet lifting her spirits with a delicate sense of possibility. Alexander finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of thought rather than command, commenting on a subtle aspect of the performance, his words precise yet gentle, causing Emily to incline her head slightly in acknowledgement, a small, private smile forming as she realized the depth of his attention. The hall remained still, filled with the echoes of piano notes that no longer played, the fire's warmth, and the drifting snow outside, all coalescing into a perfect moment of quiet reflection and mutual recognition. Emily felt a new confidence rising within her, a certainty that her music had not only reached the ears of the Duke, but had stirred something deeper, an awareness of possibility, a path forward filled with subtle understanding, trust, and the beginnings of a bond that neither had fully named, but both sensed as the night continued, enveloping them in the gentle embrace of shared silence, candlelight, and falling snow. The evening deepened, and the flickering glow of the candles cast a gentle light across the hall, tracing the contours of Emily Hartwell's face as she moved with careful grace toward the piano once more, her hands brushing lightly over the polished wood, fingers poised above the keys, sensing the resonance of the room and the subtle tension that lingered in the air. Duke Alexander Whitmore remained near the hearth, the soft warmth highlighting the sharp lines of his face, the shadows dancing across the features that had long held a reserve few had ever witnessed being touched. Emily felt the weight of his gaze, steady and patient, observing without intrusion, a quiet acknowledgement of her presence and skill that lent her confidence and a sense of calm authority. The snow outside had settled into a soft blanket over the gardens and rooftops, muffling the world beyond the castle walls and leaving the hall steeped in quiet, intimate stillness. She drew a measured breath and allowed the first notes of a gentle nocturne to flow from her fingers, each sound carrying not just the melody, but the subtle currents of her thoughts and emotions, a language of unspoken understanding and shared presence. Alexander's attention remained fixed, yet he relaxed into the moment, his posture easing, shoulders softening, a faint catch in his breath betraying the effect the music had on him, a rare vulnerability that passed between them without the need for words. Emily's eyes lifted briefly to meet his, and in that silent glance, she sensed the acknowledgement of her effort, the recognition of her courage, and the faint spark of connection that had begun to take root. The room seemed to hold its breath along with them. The crackle of the fire, the flicker of candlelight, and the distant whisper of the wind outside combining into a quiet symphony that mirrored the delicate interplay of attention, admiration, and restrained emotion shared between pianist and Duke. Each measure she played strengthened the invisible thread linking them, a current of trust and cautious curiosity, and Emily found herself moving with greater fluidity, her fingers gliding over the keys with newfound certainty, feeling the resonance of the music not only in the room, but within the presence of the man who had become both her audience and her mirror. Alexander shifted slightly, the subtle motion deliberate, drawing just close enough that the warmth from the fire touched them both, yet maintaining a respectful distance, his eyes never leaving hers, an unspoken promise of regard and attention that Emily accepted quietly, her pulse steadying even as anticipation lingered. The final notes of the nocturne trailed into the warm stillness, leaving a resonance in the air and in the hearts of both, a silent acknowledgement that the exchange, delicate and unspoken, had changed the tenor of the evening irrevocably. Emily drew back slightly, her hands resting on the keys, allowing the echo of her music to linger, and Alexander inclined his head just so, a subtle sign of admiration and the first hint of ease in his otherwise measured demeanor. The snow continued to fall outside, the lanterns casting a gentle glow, and in the hall the warmth of candlelight mingled with the quiet pulse of possibility, leaving both Emily and Alexander poised on the brink of an unfolding understanding, a moment of intimacy and connection born from music, presence, and the unspoken exchange of trust that would guide the hours yet to come. The clock on the far wall chimed softly, each toll echoing through the vaulted hall like a heartbeat, marking the passage of time in a space that felt suspended between the past and the possibilities of the present. Emily Hartwell's fingers rested lightly on the piano keys, her mind replaying the subtle shifts in the Duke's expression, the way his gaze had lingered on her throughout the evening, a silent conversation carried entirely by presence and attention. Outside, the snow had settled into a pristine carpet over the gardens and courtyards, each flake reflecting the pale glow of the lanterns, and the storm's fury was replaced by a tranquil hush that mirrored the stillness of the hall within. Alexander Whitmore stepped forward, the sound of his boots muted against the marble, and paused near the center of the room, the firelight tracing the contours of his face, softening the authority in his posture into something quietly observant and patient. Emily felt the subtle charge in the air as he came closer, the space between them heavy with unspoken acknowledgement, and she realized that the distance that had once seemed formidable now felt negotiable, shaped by music, courage, and the quiet pull of mutual awareness. She allowed herself a brief glance up at him, catching the faintest trace of a smile that flickered and vanished, like sunlight through clouded glass. And in that instant the walls between formality and humanity seemed to shift, if only slightly, yielding to the weight of potential understanding. The warmth of the fire mingled with the crisp chill from the balcony doors left ajar, and Emily drew a steadying breath, feeling the contrast of heat and cold mingle across her skin, grounding her even as anticipation curled in her chest. Alexander's hands rested behind his back, the subtle movement of his fingers suggesting attention and consideration, a quiet acknowledgement of the care with which she had navigated the evening, the grace with which she had presented herself, and the courage to offer her music without pretense. The hall seemed to breathe with them, the soft flicker of candles casting long, undulating shadows that mirrored the snowflakes drifting outside, and Emily sensed a rhythm emerging, a delicate harmony that was not just the music, but the shared cadence of presence and understanding between two people learning to observe one another anew. She took a measured step toward the center of the hall, each movement deliberate, the hem of her gown whispering across the polished floor, and Alexander remained still, allowing her the space to carry the moment forward, his gaze following her with quiet curiosity and respect. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she realized that the smallest gestures, the tilt of a head, the rise of an eyebrow, the lingering glance, were sufficient to convey what words could not, and in that realization a new confidence bloomed within her, a courage born of recognition and the subtle power of presence. The fire crackled once more, and the shadows danced against the portraits lining the walls, their ancestral eyes seeming to witness the delicate unfolding of a connection that had been nurtured in music, silence, and careful observation. Alexander's expression softened imperceptibly, the slight easing of his shoulders and the warmth in his eyes a quiet affirmation that the evening had shifted irrevocably, that the balance had tilted towards something unspoken yet deeply felt. And Emily felt the promise of future moments, a path of shared understanding stretching ahead, framed by candlelight, snow, and the lingering resonance of music that had begun to shape the contours of both their hearts. The hall had grown still with the deepening night, the gentle glow of candles casting a golden haze across the polished marble floors, illuminating the subtle dust motes that floated lazily in the warm air. Emily Hartwell's hands lingered just above the keys of the piano, her fingers poised yet unmoving, as if waiting for the right moment to let the music flow again. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood at a measured distance, his steel-gray eyes fixed on her with a quiet intensity that seemed to follow every subtle shift in her posture, every hesitant breath, every glance that strayed toward the window where the soft moonlight painted silver lines across the frost-kissed gardens. The storm outside had fully softened, the snow now resting in perfect silence, a blanket that reflected the lantern light in delicate sparkles, and the world beyond the castle walls seemed paused, allowing this moment between them to stretch, uninterrupted by sound or time. Emily inhaled slowly, letting the cool night air from the slightly ajar balcony doors mingle with the warmth of the fire, grounding her even as a tremor of anticipation ran through her. Alexander's presence was steady, patient, an unspoken reassurance, his hands clasped behind his back, posture upright, yet softened by the subtle curvature of his shoulders, the smallest sign that he, too, was allowing the weight of the evening to settle around them without intrusion. She lifted her gaze toward him, the dim candlelight catching in her amber eyes, and for a heartbeat their silent exchange conveyed more than any conversation could have, a delicate understanding passing in the space between measured breaths and gentle movement. The air in the hall seemed to respond, heavy with warmth and faintly scented by the logs burning in the hearth, carrying the resonance of the music that still lingered in her memory, a bridge that had formed between two individuals whose worlds had been separated by distance, formality, and unspoken expectations. Emily allowed her fingers to descend lightly upon the keys, producing a soft chord that hung in the air, a tentative offering that felt like an invitation as much as a continuation of the unspoken dialogue they had begun. Alexander's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in judgment but in focus, as though he were listening to something beyond the simple notes, attuned to the intention, the courage, and the grace behind each movement. The hall seemed to breathe with them, the flickering shadows stretching along the walls, the distant snow muffling all external sounds, and in that cocoon of light, shadow, and warmth, the subtle rhythm of connection pulsed, unhurried and deliberate. Emily drew back slightly, her fingers brushing the ivory keys as she rose, and Alexander took a single step forward, closing a fraction of the distance between them, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust and understanding that had begun to weave through the night. The room felt suspended in a delicate equilibrium, the soft candlelight, the lingering resonance of music, the silvered gardens beyond, and the careful attentiveness in the Duke's gaze, all combining to create a moment that was at once intimate and expansive, charged yet serene, leaving both Emily and Alexander poised at the threshold of something entirely new. an unspoken promise unfolding in the space between them as the night continued to hold them in its gentle embrace. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the tall windows of Whitmore Hall, casting long, delicate rays across the polished marble floors, illuminating the soft sheen of frost that had settled overnight and the lingering shadows of the flickering candles from the previous evening. Emily Hartwell stood near the piano, her hands lightly resting on the smooth, ivory keys, the warmth of the fire slowly fading, leaving a gentle heat that mingled with the crisp morning air drifting through the balcony doors. Duke Alexander Whitmore approached with measured steps, the subtle sound of his boots against the marble echoing in the quiet hall, and paused beside her, the steel gray of his eyes softened by the first light, reflecting a calm curiosity that had not been there the night before. Emily allowed herself to meet his gaze fully, noticing the faint change in the set of his jaw, the small lifting of the corners of his lips, a quiet acknowledgement that had grown between them through music, presence, and unspoken understanding. Outside, the snow glistened in the gentle morning sun, each flake catching the light like scattered diamonds, and the gardens of the castle seemed transformed, serene and inviting, as though the quiet beauty of the dawn had been reserved for this precise moment. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the clarity of the new day mingling with the lingering warmth of connection, and a gentle confidence settled in her chest, steadying the rapid pulse of anticipation she had carried since the previous evening. Alexander took a step closer, not demanding, not pressing, but allowing the space between them to contract naturally, an unspoken invitation to acknowledge the shift that had begun, subtle yet undeniable, in the rhythm of their shared moments. Emily's fingers hovered over the keys, recalling the gentle cadences of the nocturne she had played, each note now infused with the certainty and courage that had been nurtured through the long night of quiet exchange and attentive observation. The hall seemed to hum in response, the soft echoes of music, the faint crackle of the dying embers, and the delicate dance of morning light combining to create a sanctuary of presence, where words were unnecessary and understanding was shared in every glance and measured gesture. Alexander's eyes followed her movements, noting the careful poise in her stance, the subtle strength in her composure, and the quiet grace that spoke of resilience and intelligence, a recognition that extended beyond mere admiration to the acknowledgement of character. Emily felt the warmth of connection in the simplicity of shared observation, a trust that had been built incrementally, a bond unspoken yet fully present, carried in the weight of glances, the pauses between breaths, and the mutual respect that had woven itself through the night and into the first moments of the new day. The room was quiet but alive with the resonance of possibility, the interplay of light and shadow reflecting the delicate unfolding of awareness. And as Emily lifted her hand to rest lightly upon the keys, Alexander inclined his head subtly, a silent gesture of approval and attentive presence, the first of the day and the harbinger of moments yet to come. In that quiet, suspended morning, the castle, the gardens, and the lingering echoes of music bore witness to a new understanding, a promise of patient exploration, and a gentle awakening of trust and curiosity between two souls who had begun to see one another fully, in the warmth of light, the stillness of dawn, and the resonance of hearts attuned to the delicate rhythm of shared presence.